Hey, it's Dr. Mitch. We're getting into nicotine too. So here's a sample item. A guy in the 1700s using tobacco probably had A, tobacco tea, B, cigarettes, C, snuff, or D, cancer. All right, well, the answer is snuff. And I think if you sort of walk through the trends we talked about before, that should be pretty obvious. The tobacco tea isn't a thing. Cigarettes really didn't get big until the late 1800s, early 1900s, and snuff would be the best answer. There's no guarantee he had cancer, although obviously, poor guy was increasing his risk. Okay, red lesions in the mouth from smokeless tobacco are called rohaplakia, erythroplakia, leukoplakia, or gross. So again, erythroplakia is the choice. Leukoplakia is the white lesions. Rohaplakia is just me making stuff up. Unfortunately, that's often a distractor that gets people to pick it. So make sure you know it's really erythroplakia, and you'll be in good shape. The stronger tobacco species is Nicotiana, robusta, or rustica. All right. Nicotiana is the genus, not the species. Robusta is actually a species of coffee that is stronger. So um, just don't want to get confused with that when we do the caffeine chapter. And then rustica, of course, is the right answer. The other one is Nicotiana tabacum, and that one's markedly more popular. I just wanted to give you a feel for those early medicinal uses. So even as late as the 1880s, there were ads like this one that suggested that smoking was somehow a cure for respiratory problems. The irony is asthma, cough, bronchitis, hay fever, influenza, and shortness of breath are all going to get markedly worse if you're smoking cigarettes. So I don't know what kind of case studies passed for evidence at the time, but it was really misleading and really sad. And this notion of having a woman smoking on it was still relatively new. Women didn't catch anything near the rates of smoking as men until probably the 1970s. And then this old Lucky's ad, basically, as people were starting to realize that smoking must be bad for you, and certainly noticed that they had some throat irritation, tried to get physicians to basically say that this was fine. There were some commercials with athletes too, these little advertisements where some baseball player who was popular, say in the 40s, saying, "Oh, it won't hurt your wind," and things like that. And so it was really a lot of denial, if you will. Obviously, physicians wouldn't recommend smoking now. If you watch old movies where people go to the doctor and the doctor is smoking a cigarette, I always get a big kick out of that. Mad Men, I think he goes to the doctor and gets these really strong sedatives, and the doctor's smoking a cigarette while he's talking to him. And then the discoloration of tooth and gum was also becoming pretty popular. So this notion was, hey, viceroys have these filters, and suddenly the filter notion was, again, an attempt at alluding to harm reduction. My grandma used to break the filter off on her old Pelmels. People didn't like them at first at all. But again, obviously none of your dentists today are going to recommend any brand, let alone Viceroys. And then, yeah, so this came out in 78 or 79. I was actually in the dentist's office and saw this in a magazine when I was a little kid. And this was trying to, basically get women to join the club, so to speak. And this was even framed as kind of a feminist move in the 70s. So Virginia Slims was all about equal opportunity, but it was basically equal opportunity for cancer and emphysema. And this was one of the first, well, at least one of the first very popular menthol brands, and this adding menthol to it. Menthol has this odd anesthetic effect, so people were smoking more and not realizing it, or basically getting this lung anesthesia, so their lungs didn't hurt, but it was basically because the menthol was altering the subjective effects. And then I'm guessing some of you are too young to remember old Joe Camel, but he was uh, at one point such a popular character that little kids knew him, uh, recognized him at the same rates they recognized Mickey Mouse. So the campaign essentially had to end because of some government intervention and a lot of pressure. But this notion that you get little kids into a smoking character early on and hope that when they started smoking they would turn to your product was some really dangerous advertising. The link between advertising and smoking rates does seem to exist. It's all correlational stuff, but kids who smoked were more likely to have seen movies where characters smoked, and actually the number of characters who smoke in the movies is down pretty dramatically now, although certainly not at zero. And these not subliminal, but sort of inadvertent consumption of cigarettes in movies. So, on the web you'll see Sylvester Stallone was paid by a cigarette company to use their cigarettes when he was in the movies, things like that. It was pretty underhanded, to tell you the truth. It was a rough way to try to send this message. Well, when we take a look, I'd say probably latest data, 25% of men and 20% of women are still using cigarettes. That's way down from a couple of decades ago, but it's still, obviously not zero, and there are really no health benefits. Who are the folks who are most at risk? Well, yeah, okay, men are 5 percentage points more likely. Adults 25 to 64, that's such a broad group that I can't really make much of it, but it's strange to see that a lot of folks don't start smoking until later in life and even your guys' age, but they still end up dependent and still end up struggling. But that's just sad to see. And then education is probably one of the best predictors of smoking. So the rates among folks with college degrees and graduate degrees is literally probably half what it is among folks who've got a GED or never finished high school. Below poverty level, so yeah, the folks who earn less are more likely to smoke. The Midwest, where I grew up in the South, smoking is still markedly more common, and they don't have the same commitment to smoke-free spaces that we have on each of the coasts. The uninsured and Medicaid, this is kind of sad, but basically folks who in some ways have the worst health care, if you will, or at least potentially the worst, are the ones who are more likely to end up smoking. So the consequences end up being particularly bad for them. Less likely to hear from a physician that they should quit, less likely to have a conversation with any health professional. And then the disabled, and I was talking to a friend of mine who's in a wheelchair, and he says, look, you're bored, it's stressful, there's just a whole lot of additional stressors in your day that people who aren't disabled don't understand. But even folks who aren't necessarily in a wheelchair but have other disabilities, it also ends up being just a very stressful life. So anybody in serious psychological distress, so when I lived with the psychotic folks at the halfway house, almost all of them smoked, and part of it is they're just bored. They don't have very stimulating lives in the inpatient places, and even at the halfway house, their days are structured, but not in a way that they have a lot of control over. Comorbid depression, anxiety disorder is really high. The thought that smoking is somehow going to relieve your stress isn't consistent with the data, though. But studies basically suggest that you're ending up creating stress later when the withdrawal kicks in. And then, sad but true, the Native Americans and Alaska Natives are more likely, and lesbian, gays, basically anybody who isn't consistently heterosexual identified. Again, I think that's probably just stress induced. So if you had to guess who's smoking, a gay man, 25, who has a GED and isn't earning a lot would be, a really good guess. Especially, it's hellish being gay in the South anyway, but in these same locations. I really liked this ad campaign. So this was the anti-smoking work, and just emphasizing that because smoking creates capillary constriction, you're going to get less peripheral blood flow in all areas, including the penis. And so this Marlboro Man with the limp cigarette was an intriguing message. I unfortunately never got together any data on this or how people reacted. And then it is true that at least two of the Marlboro Man uh, advertising models from back in the 50s and 60s ended up dying of emphysema. One of them at least made it to 80, David Millar. I guess he died when he was 81, but he had emphysema. Who knows how long he could have lived, and another one died as well. And that was big in the news, and it did seem to inspire a few people to at least go from pre-contemplation to contemplation as far as quitting is concerned. Well, when we get into the key features, don't drive yourself nuts memorizing all of these. Let's focus on the big three here: carbon monoxide, tar, and nicotine. I do want to play up the nitrosamines as well. Basically, each of these is going to contribute to some kind of respiratory irritation that's going to then make nicotine have its carcinogenic potential exaggerated. Generally, a lot of these will get in your lung, and the lung cell will realize that it is mutated and will kill itself. Literally, will go into same cell death. Unfortunately, nicotine prevents that, which is kind of strange. So part of why cannabis is less likely to create lung cancer, even though it has comparable lung irritation, is that THC is not an enhancer of that. THC is not an inhibitor of the cell death process, and nicotine is. So carbon monoxide, we'll get into each of these in some detail here. So carbon monoxide is just CO, right? A carbon and an oxygen. And your blood, of course, is trying to get oxygen all around in your body. So the O part of the CO gets on your hemoglobin and gets carried around to all your cells, even though it's not going to help them because they actually need oxygen, not carbon monoxide. And so it's essentially choking you. It's providing a subtle asphyxiation, right? So you're basically not getting the oxygen you need, even though you're inhaling as often. And so that dizziness in the first acute administration is basically a lack of oxygen. Your brain is not getting the oxygen it needs. The fact that you habituate to that is kind of spooky, because basically it means your brain is starting to get accustomed to having less oxygen. And Steve Manick, some of the folks in other researchers in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania basically show you're over the years going to show neuropsych deficits that you wouldn't have shown simply because of oxygen deprivation, and that increase in blood pressure is really hard on your brain as well. So tar, unfortunately, the tar in cigarettes is just like the tar out on your driveway. So it's really sticky, and then it's going to deposit itself on the cilia, the cells in your lung that have that little hair sticking off. That's all for sweeping away the unwanted particles. The carcinogens and all the irritants basically get stuck in the tar. The tar makes the cilia have a harder time. And then we're going to see nicotine actually paralyzes the cilia temporarily. So this accounts for about 8% of the tobacco smoke. That's not important. The important thing is that it glues all the other irritants down into that lung tissue. So what's up with nicotine? Well, it's intriguing that a plant would even have a molecule like this, and it looks as if it evolved as a type of insecticide. Now, tobacco growers will emphasize that it's not that the tobacco plant has no pests, but a certain subset of aphids and worms and things like that, and they eat the plant, the nicotine just is overstimulating for them, and they rarely eat it a second time. Nicotine is highly addictive, in part when you're smoking, it's such a regular habit, so you get literally hundreds of administrations in a day. So your body does adjust to that, and then when it doesn't have it, You'll have that irritability and craving and things like that. This all works in that acetylcholine system. So cholinergic receptors, that's just means they work with acetylcholine. So you do see these cognitive enhancements, although it's usually only on vigilance tasks, and the tasks are just boring as anything. You'll have to watch a clock tick, and every once in a while it'll go 2 seconds instead of one, and you're supposed to hit the space bar, and people who have had nicotine tend to do better on those tasks. But oh God, what a horrible task, right? And unfortunately, it does kind of mimic some parts of industrial life if you're working in a factory or something like that. And then indirectly, this is going to increase the release of adrenaline. So you guys know adrenaline is just a stimulant that's going to increase blood pressure, increase heart rate. Temporarily, we release it, in fight or flight when we need it every once in a while. But, to have it chronically stimulated is really hard on your heart and indirectly on your brain, your adrenal glands, and then it all has to be metabolized. And yeah, nicotine does suppress appetite, but it's really not a weight loss strategy, shall we say. When I was in Los Angeles and I'd say, hey, you probably only gained 3 to 6 pounds, everybody would scream like that was some kind of tragedy. But often what happens is it suppresses appetite temporarily, and then later you get this incredible rebound binge eating. So it's really not at all a strategy for weight loss. I wanted to thank Brianna Altman for making me these slides. This one's a little overwhelming. I don't need you to memorize all of these. It's just a couple of take-home message. So yeah, about between 20 and 25% of adults are smokers. It's linked to all kinds of nasty stuff. So everybody knows, oh yeah, you might live a little bit less. Nobody realized till some recent data, the life expectancy is actually 10 years shorter, right? So even on the packs now, they say, oh, smoking will shorten your life, but it doesn't say 10 years shorter, right? And I think that is the kind of statistic that often gets people to go into contemplation. 6 million deaths per year, that's pretty accurate. The World Health Organization has looked at that. More than 16 million Americans are living with a disease caused by smoking. Again, don't drive yourself nuts memorizing that number, but just know that it's really big and that this is really expensive. So the CDC has suggested we're spending $300 billion on smoking-related illnesses. Obviously, we could do a lot with that money in other areas. And I just like this image because it really lets you know how many health effects there are, what are the short-term ones, what are the long-term ones. The notion that, okay, your brain is going to get stimulated, but there's a lightheadedness associated with that lack of oxygen. There's definitely going to be irritation in the throat and nose and all that. You're going to increase mucus and phlegm because your body is basically just trying to react to these irritants. Dulls the senses of smell and taste. So it's odd. I actually had a client in Los Angeles who finally got her to quit smoking, and she's like, I just can't stand the smell of things. It's driving me crazy. Wasn't sure exactly how to intervene. We did some mindfulness stuff on that. But the bottom line is your food could taste and smell so much better. And in a sense, if you savor that, you probably wouldn't eat as much the way it goes. And also eating after ingesting a stimulant is always a big deal. As long as you definitely increase your respiratory rate because your heart is beating faster and all of that, you're going to see an increase in blood pressure because the blood vessels are all getting constricted. Right? We're going to see this with all the stimulants. So blood sugar is going to get released in part in relation to that increased adrenaline that we talked about before. It does suppress appetite. It does induce fatigue. So strangely enough, this muscle aching and loss of wind, so to speak, loss of stamina is pretty common. So long-term effects in the nervous system, we're definitely going to see the nicotine craving as a manifestation of the addiction process. The stained fingers and excessive wrinkling, I never thought of this as a big deal, but again, when I was in Los Angeles, that wrinkling thing was one of the most compelling reasons to quit smoking for some of the Hollywood wannabes. I was stunned by that. But basically, because the capillaries aren't bringing enough blood to all your cells, of course they're going to start to wrinkle. The mouth stuff, it's all that. Gum disease, of course, is increased, but also pretty much all the oral cancers. So in your mouth, in your throat, in your larynx, that's all going to be there. And in the stained teeth, the cigarette coffee combo, unfortunately, is really yellowing and not something that's easy to intervene. Even the whitening processes that are going on now don't seem to do a perfect job with it, and it apparently can weaken your teeth long term. The respiratory system, because it's constantly irritated, does show increased susceptibility for colds and flu and things like that. The rates of asthma and emphysema we'll get into. And far and away, this is a big contributor to lung cancer and emphysema. We'll get into some details on those later, but basically all those symptoms of shortness of breath, coughing, a lot of sputum, it's rough. And then increased risk of impotence, I alluded to that before. Infertility. So in pregnant women, increased risk of miscarriage, stillbirth, and low birth weight babies. And it's startling how just the head circumference of the babies is smaller. So obviously their brains aren't as big. It's a real big disadvantage for a newborn. All right, we're about 20 minutes in. Let's go ahead and call a break here. Go ahead and watch yourself some comedy, write yourself a couple of questions and summarize, and I will pick it up in Nicotine 3.